This lecture focuses on the origins, causes, and long-term impact of the Greek Civil War and the role of this conflict in the outbreak and escalation of the Cold War antagonism between East and West. But let us begin first with uh, clearing out some issues. What was the Cold War? Well, the Cold War was an ongoing political rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and the respective allies that developed after the Second World War. It was waged mainly on political, economic, and propaganda fronts and lasted until 1991. But why look at why should we look at the Greek Civil War and how is it relevant? How is this war in this small southeastern European country relevant and how it contributed to this hostilities that lasted for, well, almost half a century. The Greek Civil War is important in several aspects. First, in the methods. Uh, Previous civil wars in the 19th and the 20th century were usually conventional conflicts fought between regular armies. The Greek Civil War was fought along irregular lines. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that the majority of the combatants were guerrillas, were partisans. They used irregular methods of warfare, ambushes, raids, booby traps, and so on. They also used regular methods sometimes, but mostly it was an unconventional war. And nowadays, most wars, if you look at places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, are unconventional wars. So the Greek War sets in motion, is the beginning of a particular mode of civil war. Also, the techniques of insurgency, which is relevant to the methods as well. They use, as I said, irregular warfare. They also use very extensively forcible conscription. What do I mean by this? The people who fought the Greek Civil War on the insurgent side, though not volunteers, at least not all of them, many of them were forcibly conscripted. Many of them were women. Others were children and teenagers. And we see it. So this is something similar to what we see today. Contemporary civil wars, contemporary insurgent groups use children, teenagers very extensively. On the other hand, the Greek Civil War is very important on the techniques used by the counterinsurgents, by the government. The government used paramilitaries, not just the regular army, but non-state armed groups. It also used techniques such as population displacement, propaganda warfare, and so on. So therefore, the techniques used both by the insurgents and the incumbents was something new, and they were replicated in later decades by the various actors that took part in civil wars. Also, the Greek Civil War was a battleground between East and West. Nowadays, there is a very extensive discussion about wars like the war in Syria being proxy wars between NATO and Russia, for instance. The Greek Civil War also, bore this characteristic. It was a battleground for East and West. It was a battleground for the Eastern camp, for the socialist camp, and for the Western camp, for the capitalist camp. Also have new realities, displaced person, fortified villages, the usage of hearts and minds, which I've already discussed. So therefore, the Greek Civil War is very important for two reasons. First, it uses, both insurgents and incumbents use a series of techniques that will become commonplace in the subsequent decades, and also because it was the first war, it was the first proxy war between East and West. And it was there in Greece where the hostilities, where the antagonism crystallized, and East and West now begin to see themselves as hostiles, as enemies, and to prepare for other confrontations. But I spoke so far about the wall divide, about hostility between the eastern and the western camps. But in order to understand this, in order to provide some context to the Greek Civil War and to the Cold War, we must understand how Europe, you must understand the preceding decade, what happened. So as many of you are aware, between 1939 and 1945, the Second World War was waged across the globe and obviously in Europe. Now, in the end, Second World War was waged between Nazi Germany and its allies on the one hand, and on the other hand, between the Western allies, the Britain, the United States, Greece, the Greek government in exile, the Free French, the Free Polish, and of course the Soviet Union. Now, in the end, the Nazis lost. So, whereas most countries in the West were liberated, the same thing happened in the East. Here you see that Europe, a large part of Europe, fall under the Soviet sphere of influence. So places like Romania, Hungary, Poland, and so on, they were liberated in a sense, but in another sense, occupied by the Red Army. So by 1945, Europe is divided already into two different camps: a series of nations controlled by the Soviets, and another camp, which is a series of free nations that were liberated by the Americans and the British, but they are controlled by the respective governments. Now, Europe in 1945 faced several issues. The first issue was the problem of collaboration. Very many Europeans collaborated with the Nazis for a number of reasons. So the governments faced a dilemma. What are we going to do with these people? How are we going to punish them? And the presence of collaborators, the activities of collaborators, created hostilities and tensions within European countries. And in some cases, it led to a small-scale civil war. In France, only 6,000 collaborators were killed by private individuals and by the resistance organizations. There was also the issue of restructuring societies and economies. European economies were in ruin, were in tatters. Fighting had led to widespread devastation of livestock, of housing, of infrastructure. So there was another problem. What do we do? How do we remake our economies? How do we remake our societies? How do we instill a sense of belonging? How do we convince the people that that the liberation was a good thing? But this problem was not confined just in the West. There were similar problems, but also additional problems in the East. One problem was the appearance at the end of the Soviet troops that was accompanied by widespread savagery and atrocities. Hundreds of thousands of women were raped by Red Soldier armies, by Red Army soldiers. The Red Army was also responsible, for killing civilians, for looting, for widespread looting of the wealth of the liberated countries, let's call them this way. There was also the issue of regime change. Now the Red Army arrives, but very few Eastern European countries had a sympathy for the Soviet Union before the war. Very few of these countries had a functioning communist party, and now all of a sudden a communist army appears. So the question is, what do you do with the Soviets? And the Soviets also were thinking, what do you do with these countries? Though no, the communists were very few, our influence was very small. So how do we deal? Do we incorporate these countries? Do you broaden the Soviet sphere of influence? Do you let them go their own way? So these are very important questions, both for the Soviets and for the citizens of Central East and the politicians of Central Eastern European countries. And there was another issue. The issue was the punishment of collaborators, because in places like Romania or Slovakia, tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people collaborated. So the question is, what do we do with them? Do we punish them? Do we let them go free? And if we punish them, how do we punish them? And if we punish, for instance, civil servants, and we send them to prison, who is going to run the civil service? So these are the sorts of dilemmas also faced by the Soviets. And Greece actually encapsulates all these divisions and all these problems. Greece experienced a triple occupation by the Bulgarians, the Germans, and the Italians. The country was divided into different spheres of influence. It suffered famine and deprivation, and as a response to this, there was a very large resistance movement rose. But the resistance movement was not unified. Half of the the largest resistance organization was pro-communist, and there were other smaller resistance organizations that were monarchist or republican. And by 1943, there is fighting between these organizations. So the national liberation struggle turns into a civil war. And this fighting escalates in the summer of 1944, just on the eve of the liberation of Greece. And in the summer of 1944, approximately 30,000 Greeks are killed by pro-communist partisans in a series of bloody battles. And this leaves behind a bitter legacy. Now, Greece is liberated in October 1944 by British troops. And so the British and the Greek government try to, find a solution to this problem, the problem of punishing collaborationists, of restructuring the economy, and so on. But not everybody agrees with the solution proposed by the government. I mean, the left, for instance, suggests that collaboration should be punished very harshly, and that there should be a widespread purge of of anyone who collaborated in any sense with the Germans and the Italians and the Bulgarians. The right and the Republicans disagree, and they pursue more moderate policy. And these divisions actually escalate once again into a civil war. So in December 1944, the communist troops attack. The communist partisans who had not demobilized yet attack the government installations, government buildings. The government is losing ground, so the British army intervenes. They push back the communist forces, and they bring peace. So in Athens, to summarize this, in Athens, there is fighting between the communist left and the government on the one hand, and the government and the British army on the other side. The British intervene, and peace is restored once again. But these problems were not confined to Greece. So the question is, was this fighting a case of Greek exceptionalism? Was Greece kind of a pariah? The answer must be no, because we have similar incidents all across Europe. As I've already noted, approximately 6,000 collaborationists were killed by the French partisans and by French individuals in the between 1944 and 1945. And these killings were much more widespread in Italy. Now, Italy, after the fall of Mussolini in the summer of 1943, witnessed the rise of a very large mostly left-wing partisan movement. So the partisans, once again, they faced this dilemma. After the liberation, what do we do with the fascists? And many of the partisans, many of the left-wing partisans, were very much in favor of exterminating the majority of fascists. So have widespread killings, especially in the area in places like in the areas of Lombardy, in the areas of Emilia-Romagna, where thousands of people are executed by the partisans without trial. And this instability, so have instability in Italy and France, which are also at the verge of a civil war. But there are also other divisions. For instance, places like Berlin or Vienna were divided into a Soviet sphere and to an Anglo-American sphere. So the question is, who was responsible for each sphere? What were the responsibilities? And this division also led to different policies. I mean, the Americans and the British had one policy for dealing with collaborationists or with fascists, with Nazis, and the Soviets had very different ideas. They have very different ideas about restructuring the economy, or about dealing with the problem of law and order, or about the problem of provisioning, of feeding the population, because these economies were in ruin. And these divisions, this antagonism, these hostilities became even more bitter and even more pertinent in places like Trieste, in the borders of Yugoslavia and Italy. Now there was rivalry. There was a conflict between, on the one hand, between the communist Yugoslav partisans, on the one hand, and between the English, the Americans, and the Italians, on the other hand, for the ownership of Trieste, which was a very important port. So the entire issue is to whom this place belongs. The Yugoslav partisans tried to push their own claims to this area, and there were clashes between partisans and between allied forces. So there were very, very widespread problems, from Athens to Yugoslavia to Berlin to Vienna, and to obviously Italy and France. Summarize this, to summarize this issue. So East and West, they found themselves facing several problems: how to deal with collaborationists, how to cleanse, the civil services and the armies and the police forces from fascists and Nazis and collaborationists, how to deal with restructuring the economy. And they respond in different ways. In some places we have mass killings, in other places clashes between East and West, in other places in Trieste we have clashes. In Berlin and in Vienna things are more peaceful, but there is a lot of, but tension brews. So there is also tension. And so the allies, both the western side and the eastern side, are facing choices and dilemmas. Do we, pursue a policy of hostility, of active intervention? Do we, this is what, for instance, the Western Allies thought. Stalin thinks, do I also pursue a policy of hostility and indirect intervention? Do I absorb these countries into the Soviet Union, into the Soviet sphere of influence? How do I deal with the existing political structures? So these things, come into the surface more and these dilemmas become more and more and more intensive. And so this dilemmas are pertinent not only to the East, as I've already said, but also to the West. For instance, in 1946, 1947, there were elections in Italy, in Greece, in France, and so on. So the problem is, that in these countries, the Communist Party movements are very, very powerful. So the Americans are now, and the local governments face another very big issue. What if the communists win and come into power by peaceful means and aims? How do we deal with this? How do we stop them gaining force through the elections? So in Italy, there is a very big, so in the Italian national elections, there is a very big campaign, propaganda campaign, funded by the Americans and the British, that warns the Italians that if they vote Communist Party, they vote for Soviet rule. So as you can see in this picture, it's vota osarai tuo padrone, which means here you see the skeleton in the Red Army uniform, and this translates as vote or this will be your boss. So there is this problem, right? So there is a problem, and we have widespread intervention, both Western American and British intervention, both in Italian elections, in the French elections, and in the Greek elections. But these are not the only issues, the elections. There is issues, in the allied nations. For instance, Britain had expanded a lot of wealth and manpower to help liberate Europe and obviously to keep itself free from German, occupation. And now the British think maybe we have spent way too much money and manpower in liberating Europe. Maybe now it's time to look at our own. Maybe it's time to retire from the continent. And also, this is a cause of concern for many who think, what if the British retire? Who's going to step in the place? Soviets? Maybe we'll see a resurgence of fascism. Who knows? So there are widespread worries among European nations. Also, there is the issue in Germany, and the issue in Germany is, how to restructure, and the issue of Germany, how to restructure and rule Germany, because, as I said, Germany was occupied by, on the Western Germany, by the Allied forces, British, American, and French. Eastern Germany by the Soviets. So there is the question: do we want, should we reunite Germany? Should we divide Germany? How are we going to deal with the legacy of Nazism? Do we purge? Do we kind of all these former Nazis? And if we do that, how do we deal with the gaps that will be created in the civil service? So there are these issues, and in Greece, once again, these issues become more intense. And in 1945, 1946, Greece is in a case of anarchy and instability. The fighting that I've just mentioned, the fighting that took place in December 1945 in Athens, comes to an end in February in 1945. But neither the left nor the right are willing to lay down their arms. So the right unleashes a wave of terrorism, of paramilitary white violence that targets leftists, and the left and many leftists also continue the subversive activities. So in Greece, we have both white terror and red terror. And this persists up until the March 1946 elections, because in 1946, the various parties have decided that, we should hold elections that will decide the future of the country, if the monarchy will be reinstituted, what kind of constitution are we going to have, what kind of polity we're going to have. And the communists boycott these elections, and civil war breaks out in Greece in March 1946. But Greece was not the only, but this was not just an internal Greek affair, because already I've tried to sketch an image of a Europe in turmoil and of the importance of the foreign factor, about the role of the Soviets and the British and the Americans. So the Greek Civil War was not an isolated event, it was a part of a broader wave of hostilities, a broader wave of unrest across Europe. And so the Greek civil war is set in motion not just by the Greeks, but also by outside forces, like the Yugoslavs and the Soviets. Here in this image, you can see Marshal Tito, Josip Broz Tito, who was the leader of and the founder of the Yugoslav partisan movement and the leader of Yugoslavia. Now, Tito is very much a committed communist, and Tito wants to export the revolution and turn the entire Balkan Peninsula into a communist confederacy controlled by the Yugoslavs. So Tito encourages Greek communists to pursue an aggressive policy against the government. On the other hand, Stalin is more prudent and more cunning. He's not so very much willing of a direct confrontation because he's afraid that the Greek civil war might escalate into a global civil war. But nonetheless, he keeps encouraging Greek communists to pursue an aggressive policy, hoping that this might result in some pickings for the Soviet Union as well. So Tito and the Yugoslavs engage directly, and they play a very important role in the outbreak of the Greek civil war. Stalin is not so much engaged, but he's not discouraging the communist forces though, as he waits and see in case the Soviet Union is able to encounter some benefits. And the Americans at this time, they are quite terrified because they see, the Greek Civil War also coincides with the communist takeover in places like Bulgaria or in places like Romania. So the Americans and the British now see that, the Soviets, communism is enroaching across Europe. And now politicians like Churchill are warning the Americans that that the Iron Curtain is raised in Europe, that the Soviets are bent on world domination, and that they must respond as quickly as possible before they see the entire European continent turning communist. So the Americans respond by the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was designed by an American military officer, high-ranking military officer. And the Marshall Plan entails the reconstruction of European economies with American economic help. So the Americans decided the best way to prevent a communist takeover is to provide European countries with money to restore the economies, to restore prosperity, and thus to undercut the social basis of communism and to undercut the causes that had led to the rise of communist movements, poverty, joblessness, and so on. But what did the Americans step so decisively? I mean, first, as I said, it was the fear of communism. But on the other hand, it was British withdrawal. The British, by 1947, they simply cannot afford propping up the European economies. They say, we aren't going to look at our own, so you better step in, otherwise we can do very, very little. So the Americans step in, and they are prompted by the inability of France and Britain to restructure the economies. France is also facing serious economic problems. Very much like Britain, it was forced to prop up, to provide for the German and for the Austrian economy, and they simply cannot provide anymore because they're afraid that that the more money that we spend to sustain the German and the Austrian economies and occupation regimes, the more we deprive our own countries and our own citizens. So the Americans understand that this cannot go anymore, and they decide to pour money into Europe in order to stop the spread of communism, to support the contention of the Greek Civil War. And here in this map, you can see George Marshall, the person who was responsible for devising this plan. And you can see some of the sums provided. For instance, the British economy received almost $3.5 billion, almost $2.25 billion were given to France. Approximately $1 billion to the Netherlands, $1.5 billion to West Germany, $500 million to Austria, $1.2 billion to Italy, $376 million to Greece. All the Americans gave very substantial help in order to prevent the spread of communism. But now Stalin is very, very much scared of this, because he thinks, okay, now they're giving money to the West. What if they give money to the East? Because the Americans are willing to give money to everyone. They're willing to give money to the Poles or to the Czechoslovaks. So Stalin calls this, for instance, that he warns the leaders of these European countries that this is not going to be tolerated. He prohibits, for instance, the Czechoslovaks from receiving any American money, and he begins to Sovietize the Eastern European and Central European states and economies. But what is the Sovietization? Sovietization is they use what they call salami tactics and popular fronts. So, as I've said, the communist parties were very weak. So instead of setting up a single, so instead of, and they're also afraid that if they try to impose communist parties by force, there might be a backlash. So what do? They construct this Popular Front. So Popular Front government was a government that consisted from very many different parties. So instead of having one communist government, the Soviets allow the creation of this multi-party governments that also include communists. So what did they achieve by this? On the one hand, they achieved to come into the center of power without using military means. And on the other hand, they managed to divide the different parties. So they use salami tactics. So they managed to divide the political scenery, the political scene by forging alliances with some groups, or and using them against other groups. So we have this salami tactics and popular fronts, which is kind of a divide and rule strategy that divides the political world, the political establishment, while also allowing the Soviets to come into the center of power, the Soviet-propelled communist parties. And they use this to slowly take over institutions. So by the late 1940s, universities, schools, and so on are being taken over by agents and by communist sympathizers. So, for instance, in Czech universities, all the old professors who were trained during the period of the Austro-Hungarian rule are being fired. Also, those who were trained during the rule of during the post Austro-Hungarian period, during the 1920s and the 1930s, are also fired, and Soviet trained professors take over. Also, the curriculum changes. What students were taught in high schools and middle schools, it also changes. Soviet propaganda is widely disseminated in schools. Students hear over and over and over again the Soviet Union is the future, and the old political world was treasonous, and the only way to go forward is by embracing, the Soviet means and methods, the Soviet policies. So the Soviets use soft power and cultural policies to legitimize the gradual takeover of power, and this propaganda is being coordinated by this person that you can see in this picture, Zdanov, who also who assembled, in 1947, he assembles cultural and political leaders from all around East and Central Europe in a retreat in a country manner in Poland, and he tells them, now listen, we are going to begin this slow process of Sovietization, and these are the policies that you're going to use: salami tactics, popular front, the takeover of institutions. But this also leads to backlash. As we already said, there is a civil war in Greece, right? A civil war in which the Communist Party plays a very important role. But there are also civil wars in other parts of Europe. But these are civil wars against communist takeover. So this process of Sovietization leads to a backlash in Poland. So in Poland, we have the creation of this. Poland had a huge resistance movement during the Second World War, and as soon as the Soviets step in, they demobilize and they arrest all these people who resisted the Nazis, and they and the former resistors, seeing the policies of the Soviets, seeing what they're trying to do in Poland, they react. They take to the forest and they form armed groups that resist the Soviet rule. So you have widespread guerrilla warfare and almost a civil war in Poland. The same thing happens in Ukraine. So the re-establishment of the Soviet rule in Ukraine leads to a backlash among Ukrainian civilians, who also raise guerrilla bands and they resist the Red Army. And the exact same thing happens in Romania. Romania had in Romania before the war, the Communist Party was very weak. The Soviets invade Romania. They behave in a ghastly manner. They rape, they loot, they torture, and they try to take over the Romanian state by establishing their own public governments. So many Romanians, about 10,000 of them, respond by, by seizing arms, going to the mountains and forging anti-Soviet groups, anti-Soviet resistant groups. So there is so in the entire European periphery, from the Baltics to Poland to Ukraine to Romania to Greece, there is civil war. So, but Greece, but this is even more pertinent in Greece, because so for instance in Romania there are about 10,000 partisans waging war against the Soviets, but in Greece there are almost 40,000 communist partisans waging war against an army that's of a 250,000 soldiers. So in Greece things are much more serious, and Greece are much more serious because Greece is seen as a key country. The fact is that the Americans are afraid if Greece falls, the rest of Europe falls. And Tito and the Soviets, they think the exact same thing. So Greece becomes a global battlefield. The Americans send money, but they also send military advisors, and they send equipment to Greece. At the same time, the Soviets and the Yugoslavs also send money, equipment, and weapons to the Greek communists. So Greece becomes a global battlefield between East and West. But let's see this let's focus in Greece now, because so far we have tried to locate Greece within a broader European setting. But who are the people who waged this war? On the communist side, it was Nikos Zachariadis, a Greek communist leader, a person of low birth, low moral standards. There were even rumors that he engaged in common crime. He's not very well educated and he's not very brilliant, but he is the man of the Soviets. He's a yes man of the Soviet regime. He's a Stalinist. So for them, he is the ideal person to lead this. On the anti-communist side, there's first King George, who dies in 1947. He's succeeded by his nephew King Paul, because there was a restoration of monarchy in Greece. And on the political side, there's Themistoklis Sofoulis and Konstantinos Tsaldaris. Both of them are quite old. Sofoulis is in his 80s, but he's a veteran of several wars of liberation, and he's a committed Republican and a committed enemy of the communist guerrillas. But who are the persons, though, who joined the communist guerrillas? Who were they? Why did they fought? Propaganda often presented and argued that these communist guerrillas were, citizens who are being oppressed by a right-wing government, and they just, went into the mountains to resist and to save their lives. But the situation was much more complex. First of all, very many of them were burdened with common crimes, so they joined the communist partisans in order to avert the punishment for the crimes at the hands of the government. Very many were also trained in Yugoslav camps by Yugoslav military advisors. Very many of them were committed communists, but others were not communists. Others were forcibly conscripted under pain of death. This was particularly the case for women. Thousands of women were recruited by the communist partisans, and the majority of those women were coerced. But if these people were not all communists, how were they kept online? Why did they not just desert or turn the weapons against the commanders? The question must be, the answer is institutionalized terror. For instance, people who spoke against leadership, they were bound to be murdered, they were bound to be executed, they were bound to be sent to prison. So they use a combination of terror and propaganda to control their own troops, but also terror and propaganda to control the civilian population. But what about the government side? The fact is that the government side was, soldiers sometimes on the government side was equally less enthusiastic, because Greece, experienced a very brutal occupation. So just some people who wanted to be left alone. They had, they really did not want to fight anymore. They did not want to risk their lives anymore. But the tactics of the Communist Party, the tactics of the communist insurgents, convinced many soldiers that unless they deal with this threat and they deal urgently, then the Greek economy, the Greek society was going to collapse. So they were initially unwilling, but later on they became more and more engaged and more committed to suppressing the rebellion. But the fact is that initially, much like the soldiers, other segments of society were not able to understand, to perceive the extent of the communist threat. So the church, civil society, initially, they were not able to understand how much a threat this posed. But by 1947, 1948, we have a mobilization of the entire civilian population against the communist threat. But we also had the widespread white terror. But the government is not only use conventional tactics, but they also use terror waged by parastatals, waged by paramilitaries to suppress communist rule. So tens of thousands of communists or communist sympathizers are either imprisoned or executed by parastatal groups, by paramilitary groups that are affiliated with the government. And the war slowly escalates. So by 1948, the war was waged mostly along guerrilla lines. But by late 1947, early 1948, this changes. Why? Because as you see here are the northern borders of Greece. So the communists received supplies and guns and weaponry, ammunition, with the help of the socialist regimes in Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. So this allows them to create a more extensive territorial base on the northern border. It allows them to use socialist bloc countries as a base from where to wage, to unleash raids against Greek soil. And they hope that with communist help, the help from the Eastern Bloc, they will be able to create their own state within a state in northern Greece. And this leads them to pursue different policy, of static warfare. So by late 1948, there is widespread conventional warfare in the northern borders of Greece, where new methods are being tested. So for instance, the government uses napalm bombs to dislodge the communist forces from their hideouts and from their bases in Greece's northern border. And this is the first time the napalm bombs were being used. They're going to be used later on in Vietnam. But the tactics of the Greek government, in a sense, they pay dividends. And even though the communist insurgents are still strong, they begin to lose ground. They begin to lose ground even more in 1948, when we have the Stalin-Tito split, the Soviet-Yugoslav split. But what was this? Tito was a committed revolutionary. So, for instance, as soon as Tito established his regime in Yugoslavia, he tried to collectivize agriculture, to impose communist control over society. But Stalin was afraid that Tito was showing his cards much earlier than he was supposed to, and in this way he he invited recrimination and criticism for the entire Soviet bloc. So he told Tito, to kind of slow down his policies, and Tito was not willing to accept this. Also, Tito was looking forward to build a Balkan Confederacy of communist countries with Yugoslavia as its center. And Stalin was afraid that this might create a separate bloc of power, a Yugoslav, a kind of dominated communist bloc that will be antagonistic to the Soviet bloc. And eventually there is mutual recrimination. The Soviet Union accused Yugoslavia of imperialism and vice versa. And by the late 1948, there is a complete and final split between the two countries. And this has a very important impact on the Greek Civil War, because up until then, because the Greek communists are being forced to choose between Stalin and Tito, and they choose Stalin. So Tito stops providing them with help through Yugoslavia, and this considerably weakens the position of the Greek communists. And so there is a fallout between the Greek Communist Party, the Greek Communist insurgents, and Tito. And this leads to divisions and persecutions within the communist ranks. People who are perceived as being too close to Tito or too sympathetic to Tito are arrested and in some cases executed. And now the Americans see that this is their opportunity to step in and to accelerate help, and now they begin pushing the Greek government to pursue more vigorous tactics against the communist insurgency. But what are these tactics? Now, the war in Greece has created a very big problem. Problem of the economy is faltering. Many people are forced to abandon their homes, to flee either the communist guerrillas or the parasitic groups used by the Greek government. So there's a problem of refugees and displaced persons. There's a problem of communist control in the countryside. So the government thinks, what do we do about these people, right? How do I stop? How do I stop the communist insurgents from recruiting the peasants into their armies, from drafting the peasants? How do I stop the peasants from supporting the communists? So they decide to pursue a policy of draining the sea. So the idea is that the idea of the communist insurgents is that they move like a fish in the sea. The sea is the peasantry. The sea is the countryside. The countryside gives them food, hideouts, recruits. So the Greek government decides that I have to drain the sea. What do I mean by this? Remove the peasants from the countryside. And if I remove the peasants from the countryside, there are no more recruits. There's no more help. There's no more food for the communist insurgents. So peasants are moved from the mountain villages to lowland fortified villages where they are kind of surveilled and supervised by the government forces. At the same time, the government chooses they do not only suppress, they do not only victimize the peasantry, but they also use the American aid to reconstruct infrastructure in the countryside and thus to generate loyalty among the peasants. At the same time, they pursue new and more and better military policies. They use, for instance, special forces. The special forces are used to ambush and to hunt down, to track and hunt down and to attack, the communists and take and use guerrilla warfare against the communist guerrillas. So, for instance, in a place in Peloponnesus in southern Greece, special forces encircle and destroy several communist detachments, and after the special forces take on the core communist supporters, then the army follows, it sweeps and destroys the last vestiges of communist rule of the communist insurgents, and thus Peloponnesus was cleansed. So the government uses more aggressive military tactics, and these tactics, they pay dividends. How did the Soviets respond to this? Because now the Soviets see that, okay, we are losing the battle in Greece. What is going to happen in the rest of Europe? Now, from 1949 onwards, they pursue a policy of complete Sovietization. So the salami tactics, the old popular fronts are out, and Stalinist dictators are in. So we have one-party rule across Central East Europe. The people who are put into power by the Soviets are Stalin copycats. They imitate Stalin and the Soviets in their style of government, and also in their policies as well. So they build their own cult of personalities, and they build the Stalinist culture. And also they use terror now. For the first time, they use show trials and terror to suppress any dissenting voices in their own countries. An example of this terror was the Pitest experiment in Romania. The communist regime in Romania arrests thousands of intellectuals that put them into this Pitest prison, and there they use torture, brainwashing tactics to turn them from anti-communist to communist. So torture, show trials, execution, and Stalinist policies are widespread across Central East Europe, which becomes now a dependency, a complete dependency of the Soviet Union. And these policies also lead to a backlash in the West. So communist parties are disbanded across Europe. For instance, in Greece and Germany, communist parties are outlawed. Western countries build very large repressive apparatuses, and they even collaborate with criminals and with gangsters in order to suppress the communists. So they understand that that the communists are adopting aggressive policies, and we must be equally aggressive in suppressing what they now see as an internal danger. Trade unionists, communist parties, they use spies and criminals to suppress them, to persecute them. So there is also an anti-communist backlash in Eastern Europe, and there are other consequences as well. The consequence is that Europe reaches now the Cold War is in full swing in Europe, and both the East and the West now decided it's time to pursue this Cold War abroad. So in the 1950s, we have uprisings, anti-colonial uprisings that are being supported by the communists in places like China, Vietnam, and Algeria. So in these places, local groups, local communist groups, and local nationalist groups are being funded by the communist forces to steer unrest against Western power. So we have proxy wars, an era of proxy wars. So Greece was the first proxy wars, but now East and West, after they have seen what happened in Greece, they use the same model. And also they use the same methods. For instance, the methods used by the communists and the anti-communists in Greece are replicated across, Asia and Africa and Latin America. So, for instance, in Malaya and Kenya, where there are widespread communist insurgencies, the British respond by using, as the Greeks, the militias, and paramilitaries. They displace population. They also use aid, and they try to rebuild infrastructure in order to win the hearts and minds of peasants. They also create fortified villages. They use anti-communist propaganda. So the experience of Greece is applied all over the world in these proxy wars and in the struggles for decolonization. So, and looking this back, what was the Cold War inevitable? What were the differences between Soviet and Western tactics? What was the impact of Europe? What was the impact on the global level? The answer must be that the Cold War was indeed inevitable, that the Soviet model was expansionist in its heart, and even though they were unable to pursue these policies in Europe, they tried to weaken capitalism and the capitalist scam by pursuing these proxy wars around the world. What were the differences between the Soviet and the Western tactics? The Soviets and the Western powers, they also use these proxy actors. They use local political actors to advance their agendas, and in doing so, they also set in motion these conflicts. What was the impact of Europe? The American intervention in Europe led to reconstruction. The economies were given breathing space. The communist takeovers were averted, but this also led to the Americanization of European societies and economies. And what was the impact on the global level? Well, the intervention of the Soviets led to the acceleration of decolonization. So countries that were colonized by the Europeans now slowly kind of shed the yoke of European rule, and this also led to the spread of communism in across the globe. So, in short, why did we study why was the Greek Civil War important? First, because this was the first place where the tactics of proxy war were tried. This was a place where the Soviets and the Western militaries and politicians also witnessed and also implemented new methods of counterinsurgency. And the methods used to wage insurgency and the counterinsurgency in Europe, in Greece during the Greek Civil War, were applied later on across the globe. So Greece was the first stage towards a global civil war.